So tonight I'm going to be talking about getting started with SQL Server Reporting Services, SSRS. Before I really jump into that though, I just want to present a little bit about who I am. So I'm a consultant with Talent. I work with Turner. I've been with, and I work with Tom too. I've been with Talent for just under 2 years now. I actually went to school for education. So I have a degree in education. I had a teaching license and then went into IT. And the way that kind of happened was, it was actually closer to 6 years ago. I started as a sales assistant for a distributor of like power transmission parts. Not the most exciting thing, but while I was working there, I had to cross-train in different departments, and one of those departments was kind of their new BI field. And so I worked with the manager there who kind of saw that I had an aptitude for some of the analytics that he was doing, started teaching me SQL, which at first I was like, this is a waste, why are you making me learn this? Then I realized that I actually really enjoyed it and turned it into my career, so thanks to him for that. But after I started doing that, I found it really interesting, so I took a lot of online courses, I read a lot of books, I still have the SQL for Dummies book. And so pretty much like any opportunity that I could find to learn more, that's what I did. And then from there, I took on an opportunity. I moved out of that role, and I did data integration with a benefits administrator. So like flex spending accounts, health savings accounts, that kind of thing. And then moved into working in the financial services before finally landing at Talavant, which was really, once I got into the field, consulting was what I really wanted to do, because I really like working with data. I hope you guys can kind of understand that joy. And I wanted to do consulting because I wanted to work with other businesses to teach them how exciting it can be, how valuable their data can be if they know how to work with it. So what I've done primarily since starting with Talavant is a lot of stuff with SSIS and SSRS. So I did a presentation at SQL Saturday Madison last year on SSIS, and then I did the one today at SQL Saturday Minneapolis. I might try and do it at Madison this year. I still haven't decided yet. But that's primarily what I've done and what I really enjoy with the data engineering side of things. And then now I'm kind of moving into getting some more experience working with some of the Azure services. So I have the opportunity right now to work with Turner and Tom on some of that. So it's been a lot of fun. And then lastly, I'd just like to talk about why I'm up here presenting. So obviously, you see, I've been in this field for 5 or 6 years, so a lot of people in this room have probably been doing this a lot longer than me. I wouldn't consider myself like the expert on anything, but I am willing to at least stand up here and kind of talk about what I know and share my experiences. And when I first got into this field, I really wanted to attend a lot of events like this, but I felt like a lot of them were kind of beyond my skill level, and I couldn't understand even what they were talking about enough to like get anything out of it. So that's why I came up with this presentation and the other one on SSIS that are really beginner introductory level, so that anybody can feel welcome to come in and at least see what these services are about. And then the other big reason I present is because I'm really critical of like the amount of women that are presenting at different conferences or attending conferences. So it's kind of tough for me to be critical about that without trying to do something about it. So that's why I'm up here. Like I said, I'm not the expert on pretty much anything, but I do have a lot of experience in different things, and I like to present about it. So I definitely will also kind of lean on the audience whenever I'm giving a presentation. If there's a question that I can't answer, I always like to use the experience of everyone who's in the room as well. So please feel free at any point as I'm going through to chip in if you have anything to add. So moving into what we're talking about today. So SSRS, my target audience, kind of what I mentioned before, this is very beginner level. So this would be really geared towards somebody who has never worked with SSRS before, or maybe just kind of wants to learn a little bit more about it. Maybe you find yourself in a position, you had somebody who left, a coworker who left, and now all of a sudden you have to support all of these reports that they wrote and you have no idea what you're doing. So it's really geared towards somebody who's kind of coming at it from that standpoint. If you do have experience with this, then like I said before, please feel free to kind of chime in if you want to add anything as I go along. And you might still get something valuable out of just going through these exercises and looking at some of the examples that I built out. So the things that I'm going to talk about today, first, at a base level, what is SQL Server Reporting Services? I'm going to talk about the types of reporting that's really best suited for it, because depending on what kind of reporting you're doing, you might want to use a different service. We will look through the environment to build out a report in reporting services. Kind of have two different options with that. You can use Report Builder or Visual Studio, and we're going to use Visual Studio for that. We'll actually build out a sample report, so just showing you from a very base level. If you have a data set, this is how you get started with building a report. And then look at some samples that I've built out, just so you can see some of the more advanced functionality that we wouldn't necessarily have the time to go through in tonight's presentation. And then we'll discuss report subscription. So the different ways that business users can interact with the reports and have them delivered or go out and get them themselves. And as I'm going through, if anyone has questions on anything, or you want me to slow down, let me know. I do have a tendency, like most people, to sometimes talk a bit faster when I'm presenting, so I'm trying to get better at that. Then out of scope, things that I'm not going to talk about today, or really go into just for time's sake. I'm not actually going to install SQL Server data tools, which is what you need to build out these reports. I have in the handout that I made, which this is how you can tell I went to school for education. There is a link on here. Obviously, that's not the most handy way to go through and type in this link. You can also Google it and find it. Otherwise, I don't know if there's a way that I could get this out to people, Turner, if you're able to. If anyone wants a digital copy of this, I can provide it. So I won't actually go through installing that. It's installing a program. You guys could probably figure that out. Won't go through creating a reporting server. We're really just focusing on building the report itself. And then I won't actually create a report subscription, so that would be setting up the subscription to email out an automated report to people. I won't go through the steps click by click for that, but I will show some screenshots to just kind of walk through what that process looks like. And then the takeaways, so after I'm done here, I don't expect, unless you've already done it, I don't expect anyone to go off and be able to write the most beautiful SSRS reports and be an expert. But I just want you to understand, why you might use this, how you get started, and how to ask questions. So I think we all know that a lot of our job is knowing how to ask the right questions on Google or Stack Overflow. So just having the experience to know what's possible, and then be able to go out and ask those questions, or reach out to me or reach out to other people and say, this is what I'm working on. I know I can do this, but I don't know how to do it. So really to have that understanding, how to get started with creating a basic report, and then providing some additional free resources that are on that handout that I provided you. So first, at base level, what is SQL Server Reporting Services? It's pretty obvious from the name. It is a tool for building and generating reports. It's really best suited to tabular reporting, so a report that looks like a table. I have Harry Potter in my example because I'm a big Harry Potter fan, and that's one of the reports that we'll look at. If you want something that's more like an interactive dashboard where it has a lot of visuals and you're looking at trending and you click on one and the other visuals change, that's not really where SSRS is going to shine. It's really when you're looking at information in this way. So if you have something that's in Excel or you're exporting to Excel, that's really where SSRS is going to do a good job. Within these reports, you can utilize parameters if you do want to narrow results, so it does allow you to interact with the report in that way. So here, this example that we'll look at later, if we wanted to narrow the results down here at the top there, that's where we can enter our parameters. So you have that flexibility. And then with the reports, they can be run on demand. People can go out, run these reports, enter parameters themselves, or you can set it up for an automated schedule. So say you have a report, it has to go to everyone on a leadership team, it gets emailed out every single day. That's kind of what you can do with that. So the first thing, not first thing, but to really get started, we're going to look at the development environment. So I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint here and just go right into Visual Studio. If you're not able to really see everything, I think you guys should be able to. There is a picture of this on the last page of that handout, so you can kind of follow along on there. Typically, I like to actually point at stuff, but I'm just going to stand here and move my mouse as well. So for the recording, it's a little bit more obvious what I'm talking about. But I'm actually going to start, I'll start over on the right side here, and then work my way to the left just to explain the workspace that we're going to be working with. So within Visual Studio, like I mentioned before, in order to start building out these reports, you have to have SQL Server data tools installed. And that encompasses SSRS, SSIS, and SSAS. So once you have that installed, if you've worked with Visual Studio before, as soon as you open it up, you can create a new project. And this one I already have created, but it would just be File, New Project. And then from this menu, you have that Reporting Services option. So here's where I would name my report and just save it that way. I already have this created, so I'm not going to go through that step. But once I have that project created, over here in the Solution Explorer, so to work our way around, Solution Explorer, if you've ever worked with Visual Studio before, you've built something in SSIS, you're probably pretty familiar with this. The hierarchy here, we have our solution. So our solution could be, maybe we have this, these reports that we've built in SSRS, maybe we have some stuff in SSIS that relates to it. Those are going to fall under the solution here. And then this is where I have my project, so my sample reports project. And then within my project, I have my individual reports down here. In addition to those items, we have two more folders underneath the project level. We have our shared data sources and our shared data sets. And when we get to this report data later, we'll see that we also have data sources and data sets over on the left side here. The difference between each of these is kind of their scope as far as what they apply to. So any data sources that we have set up over on this side are accessible by all of the reports. If we have them set up on this side, it's only going to be for the report that we have open. Same thing with data sets. If it's a shared data set, any of the reports can access it. The difference between the data source and the data set, the data source in this example would be like the database that we're working with. So for the one that I have set up, I'm using the AdventureWorks database, so that's where it exists here. If I wanted to create a new data source, so brand new project, I need a new data source to work with, I would just right click on this, add new data source. And then from here you can name it. What I've always done and pretty much have always seen people do is if I am working with a database, I'm just going to give that name of this data source the same name as the database, so it's really obvious when I'm working with it. So if I wanted to add that AdventureWorks one, and I was going through that same step there, I would type it here. I can put in the connection string if I have it, or if I just click edit, then I can enter the server name. Here it's my local, so I'm just going to use a period for that, and then I can pick the actual database that I'm working with. So to get that one set up before, I just picked the AdventureWorks one, but again, I have it already in here, so I'm not actually going to create this, but it is pretty simple to actually get that set up. And then I would go through the same thing. So the data source would be the database, the data set would be the set of data that I want to work with. So if I had a query and I wanted to work with those results from that query in my report, that would be my data set, would be the results from that query. Typically, what I've done is I'll have a shared data source because I'm going to use the same data source for a lot of reports, but I won't often use the same data set because each report is kind of showing something differently. So I'll have a lot of shared data sources, and then my data sets would typically live over here and be report specific. Any questions about that so far? All right. So then moving down from there, the properties pane, which again, if you've worked in Visual Studio before, you've probably worked with the properties pane. So I'll just, depending on what you have selected, the properties down here are going to change. So I definitely recommend if you're going to use the properties pane, click around on different objects and see how the options here change, because they will change depending on, if I'm selecting this whole table versus just a section of it. The options that you have for customizing it will be a little bit different. A lot of the properties you can kind of get to in multiple ways, but sometimes it is easier to make updates just using this pane down here. So it's definitely something you want to be familiar with. And then moving on to this middle section here, we have two different tabs that we're going to be working with. So in this sample report, Up top here, there's this design tab and this preview tab. And those are exactly what they sound like. The design tab is where you're actually designing your report. So this is where I'm doing all of my formatting, assigning where I want my fields to go. And then the preview will show me what the report is actually going to look like once it runs. So that table that I have set up, now this is what it's going to look like once the actual data is pulled into it. So when you're working on actually building out a report, what I find is really helpful, because sometimes you're jumping between these two tabs a lot just to make sure that you're getting your formatting correct. What I typically will do if I take a look here and I think, okay, I want to change the formatting of this number, maybe I want bold font, I kind of have a whole list of changes. Sometimes I'll just take a screenshot of this and then put it on my second monitor if I'm working with two monitors, so I don't have to constantly jump back and forth. But you always want to keep in mind from your design how your preview is actually going to look. On the top here where I have this arrow, that's where I would have parameters if this report had any parameters. So I'll just show one that does. Up top, that's where all of those parameters would live. And when we look at some examples later, we can actually see how those get set up. And then on the bottom here is all of my grouping. So with this report, I have things kind of grouped. There's a hierarchy here with product category, product subcategory, and then product. So this is where I would set my grouping up to make sure that everything is showing up together within the table. You won't always have stuff down here, but if you are grouping, that's where it'll show up. And then moving over to the left pane here, we have two different panes that we're going to work with. This first one, the report data. There are a few things. The built-in fields are kind of the standard system variables that we might want to use. So that top one there gets used a lot. Execution time, say you have somebody running this report and you want, on that report, you want to say exactly when this was executed. You can pull that value in. Page numbers, you can pull those values in. So those you can bring right into your report, and those are standard for each one. Any parameters that you created would end up in this folder here. If the report had any images, it would show up in that folder. Data sources here, this is where I was talking about. So this data source is really a reference to that shared data source. So for every new report you create, you have to say what data source it's connecting to. And when we go through the example, you'll see how I connected it to that shared data source. And then this data set, you could have multiple data sets in a report, but I can open this up and I can see that this data set is really this stored procedure. And so the data set is the results of that procedure. And then the last thing here is the toolbox. So these are all of the items that you can use to actually build out your report. And this is what the first and second page of that handout is, just because this can provide a lot more explanation than I can go through here. A lot of the descriptions that are contained there are taken directly from the Microsoft documentation, which I have linked to in here as well. But just to go through what each of these things are. So these are all the different items that you could use to build out your report. On the top there, the obvious one is the pointer. So if you have something else selected, you have to go back to the pointer. You can click that option. Text box is just what it sounds like. It's a text box. So this here is an example of that, the product report. The line is what it sounds like. It's just a line. So that's a formatting thing that you could use. A table would be this example here. So this is just a basic table. There are a static number of columns here, but a variable number of rows depending on the amount of data that's returned. Just below that is a matrix. So the difference between the table and the matrix, with the matrix there can also be a variable number of columns depending on how you have your data set up. So we'll look at an example of both of those where the table does grow just based on the amount of data. A rectangle is really used to just help format your workspace. So when I'm building out this report, I could have a table and then I could have something else that relates to it and maybe another text box. But if I want to move those things, it can be a real pain to get them all to move exactly how you want them to. So if you use a rectangle in here, you can kind of place stuff in there, and it's really just a container to move things around a bit easier. And you will find that SSRS can be really, really picky if you accidentally move something like one little point and it overlaps something else, you look at your report and all of a sudden you have like 7 blank pages. So it can be really, really picky. So definitely recommend using rectangles early on when you're starting the build of the report. Just below that is a list. The list is I think kind of a confusing term. A list is very similar to a rectangle. If I bring it out, it just looks like a rectangle. But a list allows you to group data within the rectangle. So I'll show you an example. So it's kind of like using this grouping option, but within a rectangle itself. So then anything within that formatting tool will just repeat once for each member of the group that you have set up. An image is just what it sounds like. It's an image. So you can select that, and then you can bring an image into your report. This sub-report option allows you to embed a second report into your existing report. So if I use this sub-report, I could have this one here, pull that out, and then bring in one of those other reports. So they would all be on the same page. You can also embed that sub-report. Say you wanted that in an actual table, you can bring that into a table too. Depending on what the report looks like, you may or may not want to do that, but that's always an option. Below that, there's a chart option, so there are different types of charts that you can use, like bar charts, line charts. If you've worked with charts, you're probably familiar. So you can bring those in. I haven't done a ton with charts just because typically I am doing a lot of more tabular reporting than showing stuff in, with charts. People haven't typically wanted to see that. The next one is a gauge. So the gauge and the indicator and the sparkline are all going to be very similar in that they're just, they allow the user to kind of have a quick visual reference about the status of something. So each of those, and I'll show an example, like a gauge would show you, if you want to know how close you are to a goal, that's 100%, it'll show you where you are. So it's that one quick number that you can do that check. An indicator I've used to show like a status. If I have a whole bunch of procedures and I want to see how long each one is running for, I could set up an indicator to go red, yellow, or green depending on time. So those are just those quick visual cues that you can set up. And a data bar is also similar to that, so I'll show you an example of that as well. And then the last one, the map, is a map. It's just what it sounds like. I haven't actually worked with maps in SSRS. Has anyone here, Tom?
No.
Are they?
They're pretty easy to use. You just have to have geographic information.
Are they that great to work with, or?
I used it as an indicator of how processing was going on lines around the country.
Okay.
We were behind schedule already.
So those are all the different options that you have for building out the report. Are there any questions so far?
I have a question about the sub-reports.
Yes.
It says you can pass parameters to it and filter that report. Does that hurt your runtime of the report potentially?
I've only done it once, and the data set wasn't that big, so it didn't, but I think that it definitely could.
Okay.
So you could have, with the sub-report, say you had it in a table, you could have that sub-report referencing a column in that table as the parameter. So you could keep passing that through, so then each sub-report that shows up would match what's in that table. So it's really cool, but yeah, that could definitely go a bit slower. Another option there is you can also link reports. So if I wanted to do something like that, I could just create a link, and then when I link to that report, you can pass parameters through. So you have that option as well. All right, so the next thing that I want to go through is actually building a report. So we're just going to basically build this report because this is an example that I came up with earlier. So to get started, I would just go to reports. There are two options here. I can do add new report. If I choose that option, it's going to take me through a wizard. I don't typically like working with wizards just because I have more flexibility if I'm creating it myself. So you can certainly explore that option if you go through and you are creating something. But I would typically do an add new item and then just name this here. And I have my report, so I'm going to add that. You also could copy it and paste an existing report if that was something that you wanted to work with. But this is what the view is going to look like for a brand new report. So the first thing that we have to do is identify a data source. We can't pull any data in unless we know where we're pulling it from. So I'm going to start on the left side here because we're working specifically with the report. I do a right click, add data source. And for this one, I want to use my AdventureWorks database. So I'm going to name it the exact same thing. I'm going to be referencing that shared data set, or shared data source. So I'm going to give it the exact same name so that I know that's what it is. I could name this something different, but then I wouldn't know that it's tying out to that data source unless I clicked into it. So it's just good practice to name it the same thing. I am choosing this option here to say that this is a shared data source. It's not only for this report. And then I can just choose it from this dropdown. So now I know where I'm getting my data from. Now I have to set up my data set. So I just did a right click on here. I'm going to add my data set. And so for this, I already created a stored procedure that's really basic. All it's doing is selecting all the products from the product dimension. So I'm going to call this products. I'm typically in the habit of naming my data sources, or my data sets, the same as the stored procedure that I'm using to get the data. It's up to you how you want to name them. That's typically what I've done, just because I like to have that continuity. So I'm not using a shared data set. So this one is specific to this report. I'm going to use one embedded in my report, select that data source I just set up. And then here I have a couple options. I could enter a query directly in here, so I could do a select all from given product. I've already set up a stored procedure for it, so I'm just going to select that. I tend to lean towards using a stored procedure. It performs better. And I think just for troubleshooting, it's a little bit easier to make updates there. So this is the one that I've set up. I have a few different procedures, but it's just report underscore products. Now, if I take a look at this fields option, it's going to populate with all the fields that will be returned from there. So I click OK, and now I can get started. So really, to start off really simply, all I'm going to do is drag a table in here. When I bring this table in, it defaults to having 3 columns. Unfortunately, there is no, I've searched, and unless somebody else can tell me differently, there's no quick and easy way to add multiple columns at a time if I want to add additional data. Tom, have you ever found anything else? So other than, say I want to add more columns in here, I do a right-click, insert column, right-click, insert column. Have you ever found a faster way to?
I was thinking maybe you could drag and drop it, I'm not sure.
No, I've tried.
Yeah.
So I've spent a lot of time trying to figure this out because it can be really tedious, and I had to do one that was like 50 columns. So one thing that you can also do is if you know you're going to have that a lot, you can just have basically like a template report that you've built out this giant table, and then you can copy that table, which is something I've done because it can be a bit tedious. But otherwise, it's a right click and you're just adding one column at a time. From here, because I only have one data set that I'm working with, if I hover over any of these boxes, I can just click this drop down and it's going to let me select what field I want to work with. If I have multiple data sets, it's not going to know which one to pick, so I would have to actually drag it in. So I could select right from here, or I could click on this value and just drag it right into the table. You can see that it will try to be smart here, and even though my field name is product category without a space, it'll put a space in there. If I have an underscore, it'll take out that underscore. It tries to give it a more friendly name. Usually does a pretty good job, but you might have to make updates to that. But I'm just going to drag all my values in here that I want to work with. And we got to add one more column. So at the most basic level now, we have a report. I can go now to the preview pane, and I can see all of my data. But it looks pretty terrible. From a user standpoint, this is where you kind of start that back and forth between the design and the preview and decide how you want it to actually look. So just at a quick glance, I kind of see, you know, the column headers here don't really stand out. Maybe I want to do something, make those bold, make that a different color. These are all dollar values, so they don't really have to go out to 4 decimal places. Maybe I want to have a dollar sign. This field looks kind of squished. These aren't really in the order I want it. So that's where I kind of start making all of these notes, and when I jump back to the design. So if you've ever worked with Excel, which I'm sure probably everyone in this room has done, a lot of the stuff that you're going to do in here as far as formatting will be really similar to that. You will find that sometimes you can format or edit multiple cells at a time. Sometimes you can't. So it really depends on exactly what you're doing. If I wanted to bold this entire row, I can click on the entire row. I can choose the bold option. It will do that for me. If I wanted to change the font in all of these, right now I could highlight all of them and I could change that font. If just one of those had a different type of font though, then I couldn't do that. So you do kind of get used to when you can and can't do those things. But there I could make all those changes. I could go down here if I wanted to change the background color. That's where I can change my background color. You also have the option within each of these individual text boxes. I can right click and go to properties there, and that's where I can also configure some of these things. One thing that I noticed was that I wanted to change these fields so that they looked like dollar amounts instead of just regular numbers. From here, that's where I would right click, go to text box properties. I can change that number. So this should look pretty familiar. I want to just change that to currency. Now I could do the same thing for each one of these, but this is also where working with the properties pane can come in handy. So now that I've changed the value in this text box, I can go down here, find where I changed that format. I'm not going to remember that. Like no one's ever going to just type that in. So you can just copy that value, and now I can highlight both of these, and I can paste that in there, and that's going to change the format for both of them. So those are nice little shortcuts that you kind of figure out after a while when you get sick of doing things one at a time. So now if I go into my preview, I can see it's starting to look a little bit better. I expanded this out. We have dollar values. This still, I think, looks kind of annoying with all of the accessories. So I want to group that. That's where I would go to my table here and set up a group. So for this one, I want to add a parent group because it's going to be the top of the hierarchy here. I want to group everything on product category, but then after that, I want to group it all on product subcategory. So now if I take a look at my preview, you can see it added columns for those groupings, but it didn't take out the original ones. So if you're going to add in those groupings, you have to make sure, if you don't want those extras, that you just delete those columns. So this is starting to look a lot more like that first example that we looked at. From here, you could also put in a text box to add a title. For that other one, I had also put in an execution time. So that's where I could put this text box in here and use one of those system variables that's set up, or one of these built-in fields here. I want to know exactly when someone ran this report, so I just dragged that right into that text box. Obviously, the formatting here isn't great, but you'll kind of get that idea. Now you can see exactly when I ran this report. So that's really valuable, especially if you have somebody who is coming to you and they're like, oh, this report isn't correct. It's nice to have some of those things in there so you can kind of figure out exactly when they were looking at data. I have one of the clients that I worked with set it up so that any parameters that were being passed through to the report, they also had them print out on the report, so that if anyone ever said, well, this data isn't right, they could see exactly what they entered in the parameters to see, well, maybe you just weren't working with it correctly, or to kind of investigate why this wasn't showing up correctly. And then from here, also one thing to mention, I could sort how this data is showing up. So I just clicked on the table here, and then right-clicked on the properties, and I can do my sorting here. So you always want to make sure with this reporting, if you're going to sort your data in a certain way, you want to do that within reporting services. You don't want to do that within your stored procedure. So you can sort by multiple things. First, I can do, wouldn't want to do product. First, I can do the product category, and then the subcategory. So you can really just sort by as many things as you want to. And again, if you've ever worked in Excel, a lot of this is going to be really similar. So now when I preview it, I have all of my data sorted in that way. So that is a very basic report. Any questions about any of those steps?
I have another question.
Yeah.
I've done this before, but with the category, I'm sorry, not the category, the groups. can you put like a expandable button to, expand the
Toggle?
group?
Yep.
Yeah.
You can. I'm going to show it in a report later.
Oh,
So-
never mind then. Okay.
No, that's okay. I can show it now, but I'll show it in the one later too, and then I'll go into how to do that. So you can. You can set it up so that if you have a hierarchy, you would have it collapsed, and then you can expand it out and show those values. So I'll show one. I don't want that to be the first one because it is a little bit more advanced, so they kind of go in order here, but we'll go through that. So the first two reports that I have set up, and again, I created these just so that I could kind of display some of the more advanced functionality that we just might not have the time to build out. This first one here is very similar in terms of complexity to the one that we just built. Employee directory, again, this is using AdventureWorks data. I know it's not the most exciting, but it is pretty easy to work with. So this report would be exactly what it sounds like. If I click preview here, it is a directory of employees. I don't have any parameters set up for this one, but you can see I have some grouping here. So I did grouping by department, and then by supervisor, and then from there I have some different formatting, so it changes colors for each different department group. The underlining changes when the supervisor changes. So there's some different things that you can do with formatting to make it a little bit nicer to look at. And so if we go into the design pane here, and if I'm going through some of these different things and I don't point out like, oh, how did you do that part of it? Just let me know and I can kind of dig into it. I do try to have notes on all of these, but when it comes to formatting, this is when you really, one of the things I really recommend is getting comfortable with using different expressions. So in SSRS, you can use Visual Basic Expressions to just set different values. So for each of these, I have in each separate text box, I have inline if statements for the background color. And we can take a look at one of those. So all I did was I clicked on the box here, and then I went to the properties to look at the background color, and clicked out of that one. And you can see I have this expression in there. So instead of just selecting an expression, just selecting a color, I put an expression in here that says, all right, so I'm using this running value function. So if, essentially what this is saying is if the value is even, I want it to be light gray. If it's odd, I want it to be white. So this actual expression, this was an example of when I'm like, I know I could do this, but I don't know how. So I Googled it, and I found exactly how I would do that, this running value function. It wasn't one that I had worked with before. And because SSRS has been around so long, like any question you can think of, somebody has asked. So definitely try to figure it out yourself, but certainly ask those questions and then test them out and see if you can get it to work. So that's how I have the coloring set up for that. And then for the actual underlining, and what I had to do was I had to take that formula and make sure that it was applied to each one of these individual text boxes. For the underlining here, so that starts only with supervisor forward, I have, for the border, I have a statement there, or an expression. And if I look into that expression, again, it's an inline if statement, which I use a lot in SSRS. Basically saying if the value of the previous cell for supervisor is the same, I don't want an underline. If it's different, then I want you to underline it. So I went through that. This one, and you can also embed those, so I have an embedded inline if statement, because I found that for this data set, I had a supervisor that was repeated in different departments, and it was kind of messing things up. So this one's a little bit more complex, but it just kind of shows you that you can use those expressions to format things differently. So definitely getting comfortable with using different expressions or trying to figure out where I could use them. And you can pretty much use an expression anywhere in a report to get it to do something. So if earlier when I was talking about linked reporting, where I might set up a link, if you click employee, it would take you to a different link. You could put an expression there saying like, if the value is this, take it to this report. If the value is this, take it to this other report. So you can use expressions in a lot of different ways to really customize things. You just have to kind of get comfortable with doing it and really have that mindset of like, oh, I wonder if I could do this, and then try it out. So those are the main things in that report. Any questions about this one? Okay. And again, a lot of this is, I don't expect you to know exactly how to do it when you leave here, but just to really know that it's possible. This is kind of a step up from that last one. So it's still an employee directory. I added an image in here so you can see what an image would look like. But now I have this set up where it can accept parameters. So if I preview this report, right now you can set up your parameters to have defaults. So that way the report will just automatically run if you have those defaults set. For this, I have it pretty much just return all of the results. Beyond that, you can filter down the department or the title. So for here, I have a drop-down, and we'll take a look. There are multiple data sets in this report, and you'll notice right now, if I look at title, there are all these options. But if I choose just a few of the departments, say I only want these first 3 departments, I have these set up as cascading parameters. So as soon as I click out of there, now all of a sudden, the only titles that are available are the titles that are available in those departments. So they kind of filter one another out. So if I only want those 3 departments and then just these few titles, then I can view the report and I can limit my results. Then from there, if I wanted to limit it a bit further, say I wanted only someone with a first name. Whoops, I think that may have been a last name. Oh, sorry, that was for, I was searching in the employee field. So this search is specifically for the employee. I was looking at supervisor before. So employee with the first name Ken in one of those departments with one of those titles. So that's how I can kind of filter those things out. And with that, what you always really have to keep in mind is this report can be great. I can make it do a lot of great things, but the procedure, the data set behind it has to be right and has to be good. Otherwise, the report doesn't matter. So you have to make sure that if you're passing through parameters, you have your procedure set up in a way that it will accept those correctly and return the results that you want. So you have to do a lot of testing that way. But the way that I set up this procedure to run and accept those parameters, as soon as I create a data set with procedure that has parameters in it, it will automatically, SSRS will automatically create those parameters here. And it will say, okay, this is the parameter name in the procedure, and this is the value that's being passed to it. And these values are coming directly from the parameters out here. So this will all just create itself automatically as soon as you bring that data set in. But then you have to actually configure these parameters. So the first 2 I set up were first name, last name. These were very basic. I just double click on them. I can right click, open properties. You can set up, so here, this is the actual name of the variable, but the prompt is what it actually looks like to the user. So you can make it look a little bit nicer for the user. Here I said you can allow blank values, you can allow null values, because I set up my procedure to accept those. And then I set it up with no available values, so you can just enter whatever you want in here, and there's no default values. So that's how both of those are set up. And really that's great for a field like first name, last name. For this one, I didn't want to have a whole list of all the name possibilities. But for department and title, somebody could easily type in incorrectly. They might use a department that doesn't actually exist. So this is where I want a specific defined list. And so what I did for this parameter is, first you'll see out here, I did create another data set. And that data set was just basically select distinct department names. So that just gave me a list of all the departments. And then within this parameter, I said I want to allow multiple values. So I set up my procedure to accept those. And say, okay, available values, I want to get values from a query. So from this data set, those are the values that I want to present to the user. And that's all that they can choose from. They can't enter anything themselves. But then I also wanted to make it default to every single department. So to do that, I did basically the exact same setup for the default values. So get values from a query, I want everything in that department field. And then the title one is very similar. The way that I have this data set up is that the procedure to bring back the titles accepts the department name as a parameter. So as soon as I select the department name, that gets sent into this data set, and that's what updates the title parameter. So you just have to make sure, and really if you have the names the same, so department, in this case, the department parameter matches exactly the parameter that I have in the other one. It's just going to default to say I want this parameter value. As soon as that value is updated, I'm going to update my data set. That might have been confusing. I can clarify if you need to. But otherwise, I set this one up basically the exact same way. Available values, I want the full list of titles from that data set. Default values, I want the full list of titles. And this advanced pane here, this is the automatically determined when to refresh. So as soon as I enter the department and it sees the parameter for department has changed, that's when the system knows, oh, I should refresh now and I should update my options. So you can have parameters that will continue to limit the results of the other options. So you can kind of have them cascade in that way. Was there anything else within this report that anyone had questions on as far as formatting or changes? Really the biggest thing there was looking at the parameters. So. All right. Just a couple others quick. So this Goodreads one is the one that is the example on the handout that I gave. To build out this report, I just used a data set from Goodreads. It's not the best data set, but it was an interesting one to work with. And the way that I have this set up is using a list box. So if I click here, looks like a rectangle, says it's a rectangle, it was a list box. And so when I click down here and I look at the details of it, I can look at the group properties and I can see that I'm grouping on author. What that means is every time in my data set, every time there's a new author that comes up, it's going to create this view again. So what this data set is, it's just a list of authors, books they wrote, the number of pages, and the average rating and what the language is. So if I run this report, the first thing is I have to enter some parameters or it won't run. So I'm going to say I want all the results from this author. View my report. Now you can see each section will be filtered by author. So the way this data is set up, I'm getting multiple results here because she co-wrote books with different people. But you can see in each section, even though there's just one big data set, it's breaking it up by author. This average rating is only for, it's grouped within that list box, so it's the average of all of these ratings, and then I can see all the different books. So that's how you kind of group things in a list box. You can also embed them, so you could have multiple list boxes, so you could have different things repeating for each group. So it's a really nice way if you're trying to think of different ways to format a report. Another thing that I did here is I have the total number of books that are returned from this. And so that is just using an expression within this text box. Again, that's getting comfortable with using different expressions to show different values. So in addition to formatting, you could do something like this. It took me a while to figure out within an expression, you could also have, if you look at how it's rendered, you can see, so let's have to enter that again. You can see the font has different formatting still within that one text box. So if you wanted to do something like that, there is the option, and this is all just basic font. There's the option that you, it's kind of tricky. If you actually highlight on that value, you can do placeholder properties, and then you can allow it to interpret HTML tags. So there is a way to do it. That's one of those, like, if you're ever working on it, you know you can figure it out somehow if you look that up. Then you can see just within here, I've said, okay, I want that to actually be bold. And then this count rows function just says in the whole list of results that are being returned, how many rows. And that is going to be, so from this data set book list, how many rows are being returned, that's how I got that value. Any questions on that one? All right, last one here. This is an example of using a matrix. So I think this is a more interesting data set than AdventureWorks. In addition to all of the data stuff that I do, I'm also really into obstacle course racing. So for fun, I wanted to look at the differences in, so obstacle course racing is like Tough Mud or Spartan, that kind of thing. There's the World Championships every year, and they keep statistics on the number of men and women who complete 100% of the obstacles. So I was curious about looking at the comparison between those. So I have this data set that I was working with. And this is an example of a matrix. So you can see here, up at the top I just have year. You can't see that I have any specific years listed, but then for each year I want to know the number of people who entered, the number of people who completed, and then what percentage that was. And so I'll just show what this actually looks like, because the preview is a lot different than the design. And this is where we're going to see what Turner was asking about earlier, was this toggling feature. So I'll expand this up so we can see everything here. So this is really aggregating the data like at the base level. So there are two different courses. There's a 15K distance and a 3K distance. If I want to see, you know, the total numbers, I have those here. This is where I could click on this here and expand it out. So if I wanted to see these details, I'm able to do that. And you can set it up so that at runtime, this can start off as expanded, and then you can filter it down, or you can set it up the way that I have it, where you can expand it out once you actually run the report. But with the matrix, you can see I have different years here. So as soon as I have a new year's worth of data, that'll get pulled in. I can look at these different percentages. These are the indicators I was talking about earlier that I can set up just as a quick reference to see, okay, what percentage is that of the total percent. So you can have those embedded into a table. So for each line, you can see those indicators. And this gap here is just because they didn't have age groups that year. So that's why we have that gap there. But if I wanted to look at the different values and kind of see trending that way, that's one way that I'm able to do it. But matrix is really nice if you do want to look at aggregate values and kind of see, you know, different sums and look at different levels there. Then you can really do a lot with that. And did that answer your question? Or so to show you about that toggling that I was talking about, the way that I would set that up, so that would be expanding out those fields, is within this row here, I can just click on row visibility. And see, I have this set up to hide it when the report runs, but then it can be toggled by course. So if I click on course, it can be toggled by that. You want to make sure, so I specifically went and named this box, or this text box already took on the value of course, but if I wanted to toggle it by something else, it's really helpful to give whatever it is a name rather than like text box 75, because I've done that before. If you'd like, sometimes people will create a separate column just to have that little button because it looks a little bit nicer, so it's nice to give that text box a name, which would be over in this properties pane here. You could just name the text box, so it makes it a little bit easier. Are there any questions on this one? All right. So I know that was a lot, but again, it's just to kind of demonstrate some of the things that are possible in SSRS. I think a lot of people worked with this program a while ago and felt like they couldn't do that much, and I know some of the newer dashboarding tools are really like fun to work with and look really nice. I really like working with SSRS. I'm one of the only people in the company, I think, that really likes it. There might be 3 of us, I don't know. But I just like having the ability to control things so much. To if you've worked, you know, for me, I've gone and I've done stuff in Power BI, and I'm like, well, I just want to change this font color. Why can't I? Like little things like that. So I like being able to have the control. But then once you have the report created, so one of the big things I didn't mention is as you're creating a report, you always want to think about how people are going to interact with it. So if I have this report and I'm going to email it out as a PDF, when I go to the preview pane, there's this option here to export. You want to make sure that you actually look at what this report is going to look like for someone. Because if you're working in your design surface here and you have this set, you know, to like 12 inches, and then you're expecting somebody to get that, you know, on an 8.5 by 11, it's going to look terrible. You're going to have a lot of blank pages, And you wouldn't really know that unless you export it and see what it looks like. So you want to make sure that you're always checking that. If it's a report that people are just going to go to the report server and they're going to run it that way, you don't have to be quite as conscious of that, but then also think about, what they're going to be viewing it on. So always keep that in mind, because it's a lot easier to, like, from the very beginning, make sure your formatting is fitting than, like, when you're done and you have to go back and kind of get everything to squeeze into the design surface. I spent probably 2 hours doing that the other day, like figuring out which text box was causing it to be like 0.01 too big. So just always make sure that you're keeping that in mind, exactly how people are going to be working with this. And then once you have the report completed, obviously people need access to it. So that's when you would set up, and this was where I said I'm not actually going to go into like deploying these reports, but if somebody's interacting with the report, they're going to run it themselves. They would go out to the reporting server that's set up, and I would just click on, so these are the examples that I created. They would just click on one of these reports. If it was one that accepted parameters, then the boxes would show up for them to enter those parameters, and they could run it that way. The other option is to set up a subscription. So there are a couple different options for subscriptions. And this would be like, this report needs to get emailed out to everyone at this time. So there we go. See if I can zoom in. All right. So the standard subscription would be just what it sounds like. It's pretty standard. So send this report out to this list of people. I would enter the list of emails at this specific time every day. And then I could pass through, if the report itself accepted parameters, I could pass them through that way. The other option that you can do is using a data-driven subscription. So the difference with that would be, I could run a query and say, I don't know what's going on. I could say every day I want to run this query. An example of this would be one that we have set up internally at Taliban. So every day a query runs and it looks and says, okay, for the previous day, who didn't submit their time? I want their name and I want their email address. So that's what's returned in the query. And then that, for the data-driven subscription, is passed into the report, and then that report gets emailed out to people. So every day that report runs, and then you just get a, I had it saved somewhere, but you would just get a report saying, hey, you didn't submit your time yesterday. It just looks like a standard email, but that's an example of when you could do a data-driven subscription. So you have the query, it returns the results, then you pass those results in as parameters, or you set them as the value. I gotta zoom out here. Too far. So if you're using a data-driven subscription, then you have this option for your email delivery. So you could say, in that subscription, one of the fields that was returned was email address, so I want to use that value. And you can use the different values there to actually send out the subscription. Any questions on that? That report that we have sent out internally is really annoying because I wrote it and I get it every day.
It's the worst thing.
It's really terrible. I mean, it's effective, but it's really annoying because every day I feel like I got myself.
You're not going to get paid.
I thought about mixing it up and having an image, so every single time that comes up.
That would be, I said that I was.
The 13th, but like, randomly it pops up, it's like, oh no, you forgot to submit your time card.
I wonder how long it would take anyone who like was important enough to notice. Because I don't know if they enter their time on time, if they get those, yeah. I did say that I wanted to go in and edit myself out of the query because I get sick of getting them, but.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, I see you can do expressions and stuff to change the data and whatnot.
Yep.
Well, does it have like a programming model, let's say you have something a little more complicated, like an encrypted value you have to decrypt, or it's like a custom business function? Can you do that in the reporting software to add like custom expressions? To write your own like .NET code to change data? Or do you have to do that at higher level in SQL Server? Okay. So next thing first, so you got to make sure your data is ready, and while you need to work on that.
I have had it, I did set a report up before that I had created, like within my data set, there was an SSN column, and then only certain people, you know, if they ran the report, they didn't want to send that out to certain people, so I just had 2 columns. So one was the actual values, and then one was a masked value.
Okay.
And then within the report, I created a parameter that was just like a drop-down yes or no. And so if it said yes, then the value in the field was the actual value. If it was no, then it was the masked value. So you can kind of do stuff that way,
All right.
if that helps.
Yeah, a little bit, I'd have to,
Oh.
yeah, probably have to
And
have
thank
some .NET function, SQL Server compile code.
Any other questions? All right. So you have this handout. If you really want to read it, you can read through the whole thing. I do have a few things that I put in there as just like best practices. It's just stuff that I personally have found helpful. So one of the big things that I mentioned is your report is really only as good as like your procedure. Is there a question?
There is actually a question
Okay.
on Twitch.
Okay. Hopefully I can answer it.
JP, Wisconsin, general question, how is SSRS different from Power BI reports? And are there any licensing fees for people to use SSRS reports?
I don't know if you guys could answer the licensing fees question. The big difference is Power BI is really great for like dashboarding, interactive reports. If you want to see trends in data, you look at like really great visuals. That's when you really want to use something like Power BI. SSRS is more for tabular reporting, so anything that is like a table, something you might want to look at in Excel, row by row values. That's where you'd want to use SSRS. As far as licensing, Tom?
The actual, in order to create a report, you can create a report for nothing using the data tools. That's free. But the moment you put it out into reporting services, the web piece, it costs money as long as it's on a different instance than where your SQL Server is. The moment it's on a different instance, like it's over on a different server, darn it.
I was going to try and repeat it, Tom, but you talked too long.
Yeah.
It's quite long, so
Yeah.
repeat that real quick in front of that.
Oh, okay, so as far as creating a report, it's generally free with the data tools. After that, if you want to ever create a subscription, do anything in which requires the SSRS database, if it's on the same, if you actually have the web front end on the same server as where the SQL Server is, it costs as much as the SQL Server. The moment you move it off and put it somewhere else, it then costs another instance of SQL Server. And so rarely do people do that because that hurts your performance on your SQL Server. So sure, you can do it for free as long as you pay for a SQL Server, but rarely is that a good performance answer. So that answer it? Okay.
I think so.
Okay.
He says thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, Tom.
But some people get away with it.
I don't know if that's a good model.
No, it's not a good model. The Microsoft police will be after you at the end.
Right. Yeah, if there are no other questions, then thank you. And that's,
Thank you.
He was actually referring to